All right, let's dive right into this explainer and explore how high-stress leaders can achieve a level of psychological immunity that makes them virtually untouchable in the boardroom. If you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by workplace drama, demanding clients, or toxic employees, well, what we found in these source materials might actually change how you operate entirely. We're going to look at a genuinely fascinating framework derived straight from Carl Jung's private clinical notes, and we'll be adapting it specifically as a professional development briefing for today's high-stress corporate leaders. So, we're kicking things off with this wild case of Heinrich. He was a post-World War I steel magnate, and his absolute lack of emotional reactivity completely terrified his employees and totally baffled his wife. In fact, his wife actually brought him to Jung back in 1919 because she thought something was fundamentally broken in his brain. Get this, she confessed to having a 6-month affair, and Heinrich? He simply asked her 3 calm questions. Was she happy? Did she need anything? And did she want to end the marriage? He didn't yell, he didn't break down at all. Insults just bounced right off him, and betrayal actually made him curious rather than defensive. Jung was absolutely fascinated by the guy. Here is the executive playbook we distilled from those notes. We're covering the untouchable executive, mastering the reaction gap, the shadow mirror effect, de-escalating toxic employee conflict, your daily boundary checklist, and finally, becoming a compassionate leader. Let's get into it.
Section 1. The untouchable executive. Let's look at how this concept builds the foundation for what is essentially the ultimate corporate superpower. Jung called this state emotional impermeability. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand that leaders like Heinrich aren't just emotionally numb, and they definitely aren't just suppressing their anger. We all know suppressing emotions just eats up your energy and inevitably leads to burnout. Instead, they've fundamentally transformed how they process external chaos. They've reached a point where other people's behavior is completely irrelevant to their inner state. A screaming client or a passive-aggressive vendor, no longer a threat. To them, it's simply neutral data. Moving on to Section 2, mastering the reaction gap. The big takeaway here is figuring out how to pump the brakes on our automatic reactions so we don't take the bait when someone attacks our strategy in a meeting. You see, there's a massive difference between standard reactivity and what we're calling the reaction gap. Usually, a trigger and a reaction act as one continuous, unstoppable loop, right? Someone insults your work, and you immediately snap back. But the executive mindset inserts a psychological space in there. Heinrich actually told Jung that when someone insulted him, it was like time slowed down. The words just sort of hovered in the air, and he realized he had a choice. He could catch those words and make them his own, or just let them pass right on through him. Conscious choice replaces unconscious reaction. So how do we actually do this? Well, Jung documented something called the observer protocol, which is an actionable standard operating procedure you can literally use in the workplace today. Step 1. When you're triggered, just pause and take a conscious breath. Step 2, step back and observe the trigger as if you're watching a movie. Pay attention to the other person's body language and just observe your own rising anger without judging it. Remind yourself that you are not your emotions. Anger is just information, it's not your identity. And step 3, choose your action based on your core leadership values. You become the author of your response rather than the victim of a reaction. All right, Section 3, the shadow mirror effect. This is where we get into the real nuts and bolts of psychological immunity, taking your deepest insecurities and turning them into strategic insights. Jung realized something kind of mind-blowing. Every single person who angers you is actually reflecting a part of your own unconscious mind right back at you. Take Sarah, a marketing manager from one of the clinical studies. She realized her intense frustration with a colleague's constant interruptions wasn't actually about him at all. It was a reflection of her own insecurities and her own tendency to dominate conversations whenever she felt insecure. If a rude coworker dismissing your ideas triggers you, it's usually because of your own underlying fear of being inadequate. Once you grasp this, other people's chaotic behavior becomes an incredible diagnostic tool for your own mind. By running Jung's shadow integration protocol, you can literally turn a crisis into psychological armor. Heinrich used this exact method after a devastating betrayal where his closest partner stole his biggest client. Instead of going out and seeking revenge, he asked himself 3 questions. What trait was he judging? Greed and dishonesty. Where did he exhibit that? Well, he realized his partner's greed mirrored his own suppressed fear of poverty, and the dishonesty mirrored his own habit of hiding his true feelings. By using his triggers as teachers rather than attacks, he became entirely unbothered by the whole ordeal. Section 4. De-escalating toxic employee conflict. Let's pivot from internal regulation to dealing with external chaos. Because as an executive, you aren't just managing yourself, you're managing a whole team.
To do this, leaders need to develop what we call psychological X-ray vision. This means understanding that when an employee aggressively attacks your new strategy or constantly complains about management, they are actually handing you raw data about their own psychology. Heinrich's rival once publicly humiliated him, calling him a heartless profiteer. But Heinrich wasn't angry, he was curious. He realized the rival's intense focus on profit exposed the guy's own deep financial insecurity. He saw straight through the surface attack to the underlying wound. So, let me ask you a question. When a client publicly humiliates you and calls your work completely unprofessional, how do you maintain absolute inner peace? Think about Lisa, a graphic designer from the case files who faced this exact devastating kind of client feedback. Her first instinct was obviously to defend herself and argue back, but instead she used Jung's framework to internally de-escalate the whole situation. By deploying a tactic called projection reversal, Lisa just asked herself, what exactly are they attacking? My professionalism. Okay, where might they struggle with this themselves? She remembered the client had previously admitted to feeling like a bit of an imposter in their industry. Suddenly, she had that X-ray vision. She instantly saw that the client's attack was really driven by their own imposter syndrome and a hidden fear of being exposed. By seeing the wounded child behind the aggressive client, she literally couldn't take it personally anymore. She addressed their concerns smoothly, and her inner peace stayed completely intact. Which brings us to Section 5, your daily boundary checklist. Because let's face it, walking around with this level of calm is inevitably going to attract chaotic personalities who want to test your peace. You need a daily system to protect your energy. Jung noticed that his highly immune patients actively built what he called boundary fortresses. Think of these as invisible force fields that keep toxic individuals and energy vampires from dictating your internal state. You need a relevance filter, so you only absorb constructive data. You need an ownership boundary. Look, if your boss is stressed out and screaming, that is their stress, not yours. You absolutely do not have to claim ownership of it. And finally, you need an identity fortress. That's an unshakable core that doesn't constantly rely on external validation to survive. So here's your actual daily checklist. It's identical to the one used by David, a software engineer who is constantly stressed by a really demanding boss. Step 1, engage an emotional firewall before you even log on or walk into the office. Decide in advance what you're going to observe but not absorb. Step 2, execute pre-planned response selections. Decide before the meeting exactly how you'll calmly respond to that one board member who always interrupts you. Step 3, secure your identity anchor, in your own competence, not in your boss's fleeting approval. Within just weeks of doing this, David reported feeling totally untouchable. And ironically enough, his demanding boss actually started treating him with deep respect. Finally, Section 6, becoming a compassionate leader. We really need to address this last and probably most challenging evolution of the framework, so you don't just end up isolated behind your boundaries. The whole point here is to move from just playing defense to actively practicing emotional alchemy. This is the ability to take a trigger and literally spin it into psychological gold. Marcus, a sales manager, was constantly triggered by his team's laziness, but instead of just blocking it out, he used it. He asked, "What does this expose in me?" Well, it exposed his own inability to inspire them. So he actively used their friction as the exact fuel he needed to study motivation psychology and develop world-class leadership skills. He turned his biggest trigger right into his greatest professional asset. But, Jung did warn about the dark side here. You really want to avoid becoming clinically detached, looking at your employees like they're just lab rats in some psychology experiment. The ultimate goal is to become a compassionate warrior. This is an executive who maintains unshakable psychological strength, sure, but still remains warm and connected. You want to be able to hold space for your team's stress during a massive quarter-end push without absorbing a single drop of their anxiety. You become the stable ground that their chaotic personalities are craving. As we wrap up this explainer today, I want to leave you with Heinrich's final, pretty profound insight. True strength isn't about what can't touch you. It's about what you can touch without being changed by it. So ask yourself, are you ready to stop being a victim of workplace drama? Are you ready to start utilizing every conflict, every rude email, and every demanding client as a catalyst for your own executive mastery? Because that psychological power is right there waiting for you. Go ahead and use it.